And hello, everybody. This is Stephanie Vance with Advocacy Associates. And we are going to get the presentation started in just a moment here. We have a lot more people kind of popping into the system. But as we're getting started, I just want to make sure you can hear the sound of my voice. So if you can hear me, click the raise your hand button on your screen. It's a little button that looks like a hand. You could raise your hand in your office where you're sitting, but all right, I've got some hands raised, so we're going to get started in just a minute.
Welcome, everybody, from around the world to the Consortium of Universities for Global Health's virtual training series. I'm Dr. Keith Martin, Executive Director of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. Today's webinar is on communicating to the public, media, and stakeholders. We know these are difficult times for science, and whatever your area of expertise is, in order to affect change, we know it is critically important for all of us to reach out and engage with communities we don't normally engage with. This is especially important for us to engage with the public, media, and stakeholders. It's even more important now, where despite incredible advances in science, we're seeing more virulent and aggressive opposition to science and fact. And this is having devastating effects, whether it's climate change or vaccines, or even the COVID-19 response now. The consequence of ignoring science is costing people's lives. So we have to bridge the gap. We have to overcome this chasm, and we have to communicate to those who we don't normally communicate with. And it's important to recognize, of course, that in order to affect political change, the public can move the political. So we have to engage the public. So to share with us how to bridge that gap, we have two outstanding presenters today. Stephanie Vance is the founder of Advocacy Associates. She's written 5 books and is a 25-year veteran on Capitol Hill. She was a chief of staff and also a legislative director on Capitol Hill. She'll be joined by Jason Jordan. Jason is the principal partner for Advocacy Associates, and he has a broad experience, more than a decade, in dealing with a broad range of associations and organizations. So we're in for a real treat today. Stick around, listen to their presentations, and there'll be a chance to ask both Stephanie and Jason your questions. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Stephanie Vance. Stephanie, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. And we are very excited to be doing this session for you. I know we've got some folks who are still popping in. I want to address some housekeeping issues just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So first of all, everyone has joined in a mute-only mode. And what that means is you could speak all you wanted, but I could not hear you. And the reason why we do that is to mitigate any background noise. So if you have questions that you're going to want to address, you can type them. You should see something called questions in the questions box. And if you don't see a questions box, that is, you can type into the chat box. You should be able to see that. And if you can't find either of those, have no fear. We're available after the session to answer any questions you might have. Now, some of the most common questions I get are, will this session be recorded? And it certainly will be recorded. And I should note that someone indicated that the slides are not advancing, and that's okay because we're doing just the housekeeping part right now. So yes, the session will be recorded, and the materials will be available after the session. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jason Jordan, who's going to kick off the session here. And I know you're in for a real treat. So we're looking forward to your questions and hope this will be helpful. Thanks so much. Jason, go ahead.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Dr. Martin. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today to talk about communicating with the public, media, and stakeholders. It really is, as Dr. Martin indicated at the outset, a critical moment. And these skills are more important than ever. I'm going to focus the initial part of the presentation really around something that may feel a little unusual to some of you as you think about traditional communication skills. I'll talk a little bit about the role of narrative and storytelling as a part of persuasion and influence. Let me start, appropriately enough, with a story of my own, a short little anecdote here. A few years ago, I was taking a group to a meeting on Capitol Hill. We were meeting with a Senate Chief of Staff, and the group had prepared really fantastic materials outlining how a particular federal program had been deployed in the state. They had lots of terrific infographics and data charts about exactly how much money had been spent and where it had been spent geographically across the state. Really well presented material. The Chief of Staff leaned back after looking over the material, congratulated the group on pulling such a rich set of data together. But then he made the comment that you see on the screen here. He said, "That's what you spent. What did you build?" And he used that as a jumping off point for encouraging them to talk about the outcomes of the program, not about the mechanics of the program, making the point that his boss was less persuaded by how much money had been spent in the state and was much more likely to be persuaded if he understood the benefits and the value that had been generated. Which sort of leads me to one of the kind of overarching areas of focus for the presentation today, which is that when we think about communications, and I think particularly when we think about communicating around issues that can be technical, that can be data intensive, that aren't always very well understood by broad audiences, that it's really important that we keep in mind the role of what I will call emotional truth, the role of the outcomes that speak directly to both value and values. And I'm being quite intentional about the singular and the plural there, because sometimes I think we're talking about what is the actual value, typically in economic or return on investment sort of terms. But then other times we accomplish the same thing by speaking to people's values, the things that we believe and hold close and that bind us together as a society or a community. Very often I find, and I do spend a fair amount of time working with science-connected audiences, that there's a tendency when we are steeped in information as communicators to leave the art of communication behind, to focus on those things that to us are either self-evident, drive our point in a very particular way, demonstrate the validity of the argument that we're making. And that's important. And I'm not here to suggest that we jettison those sorts of activities. What I'm here to suggest is that there's a way of blending these things, and that in the moment we too often lean on the science and avoid the art of communication. So one of the things we're going to spend some time here this afternoon is talking about how do you find that art? How do you craft those narratives and those stories that will allow your audience to really grasp the point that you're trying to make and the data that underlies your point in a new, more compelling sort of way. I'm very fond of the documentarian Ken Burns. I'm sure many of you have seen various documentaries that he's produced for PBS. He did an interview some years ago around the time that his documentary series on baseball was released. And the interview was really about his view of storytelling and his view of documentary storytelling in particular. And he used this quote that the real genuine stories are about 1 + 1 = 3. I know that it's dodgy at best to present faulty mathematics to an audience of scientists, but I wanted to put this in here because I think it's important to think about when we're communicating about hard fact, about scientifically rigorous, indisputable fact, that often we are engaging in communication in an environment that is nuanced, that is conflicted, that is filled with lots of different kinds of information and ideas and perspectives. And that sometimes bringing in the story that speaks to that complexity, that isn't sort of framed in a perfectly black and white sort of way, is a very powerful way to acknowledge that complexity and to generate interest. One of the biggest challenges that any communicator faces in today's environment that is so noisy, so cacophonous, is how do we break through? How do we grab interest? And generally speaking, it is very difficult to grab interest using our fact-oriented first approach. And instead, a better approach, generally speaking, is to find some human angles, some things that are unexpected, perhaps, that pull us in, engage the listener in a different way. So we do want some of today's presentation to be interactive to the degree that we can using this medium. So before I go any further, since we've sort of begun to frame the conversation today in terms of persuasion and influence, I'd like to ask Stephanie to kick off a poll here, just quick and easy poll about what persuades you. What are the sorts of things that change your mind or drive your opinion? So Stephanie, you're going to have to help me. I can't quite see what's up there. I can tell if you've opened the poll, but you may have to let me know when it's running. And
yep, I'm just checking in right now. So we've got about, let's see how many people in. I'd say let's give it another 30 seconds.
Okay.
About 70% of the vote in. So if you're in that 30% and you want your voice heard, go ahead and vote. It's very important this year.
It's like election night.
Right, exactly. All right, we got about 80% of the votes in, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. And there you go.
All right. Can you tell me? I can't see them on my presenter view. What the poll results are?
Apologies. Yes, absolutely. So we have about 60% rely on reports and research, 29% rely on friends and family, 6% rely on social media, and another 6% relies on social media, and advertising is 0. So I would say that reports and research are the #1 item.
So that's really, thank you, Stephanie. That's great. And thanks everybody for taking a quick second to participate. I find those results to be really fascinating. And here's what I'll share with you. Two things. One is just a few weeks ago, I did a version of this same topic or presentation to a group of folks working in climate science space, excuse me. And their results are awfully close to the results that Stephanie just announced in terms of the dominance of facts and figures. What the other piece that's sort of interesting about that is that makes you distinctive and a little bit different from the typical profile of the general public, certainly, and certainly also of elected officials and other kinds of decision makers in the environment that you're seeking to drive a message in. Typically what we see when this has been looked at by others is that friends and family tend to be more persuasive, even in folks who believe that they're mostly persuaded by reports and research and facts and figures, that when it comes to many of the decisions in their life, the role of some of these other vectors of influence is a lot higher than you might think. And one of the takeaways for you here is to keep in mind that you need to be aware of what persuades your audience. There's a tendency on the part of a lot of communicators to assume that the things that are meaningful, persuasive, and valuable to them, that their audience automatically shares that perspective, and those same things matter in the same way. And generally speaking, that's not true. And that's one of the things we're going to dig into today in the presentation, are some of the things that might help you be more persuasive to an audience of the media or the public or some of your critical stakeholders. Just wanted to make the point here that since you are persuaded by some research, that there is research that actually suggests that when it comes to our ability to recall information, when we're asked to repeat a point or information that was presented to us, that there's something about stories and narrative layered with the fact and opinion, that fact and data, that is more memorable. In fact, up to 22 times more memorable in studies, people able to recall the story-driven information much better than the sort of factual standalone information. So what we have to do as we think about how we want to reach these key audiences with information that is grounded in the facts and the research that we have done, the data that we have collected, that it's the story that's going to help people remember the points that we're trying to make. And if you think about journalism, pick up the Sunday New York Times or the Sunday Washington Post or whatever your paper is, you'll very often see stories that are actually driven by the release of some kind of report or objective factual activity that's being covered. But the lead of that article will humanize it. We'll often see it through the eyes of an individual person or a family that's very personal, with names, with a particular situation, to ground us in that story before we're presented with the sort of broader picture. And that's not an accident. That's actually a way that many of those articles are structured, because of the understanding of how we process those articles and what sticks with us. Going to give you another shot at interaction here just at the outset. I'd like for you to take a minute and think about a childhood memory that you have. You are more than welcome to use the chat box and give us a sense of what your childhood memory is, but I'd like you just to take a quick second. It can be almost anything. Think back to the time when you were 7 or 10 and something happened, some small incident, but that is very memorable for you. It could be a very happy memory of a birthday party, or a gift from a relative, or an experience with a childhood pet. Can be anything, but it could also be something traumatic or scary at the time. I'll just give you a second to think about what your memory is. You are welcome to tell us about it there in the chat box. Would love to see some of your ideas while you're thinking about it. And I will say, most people can come up with one or two really quick. It's surprising the things that jump out at us when we think about that period of our lives. And there's a reason why I want you to do this. But while you're doing it, I'll just give you a quick childhood memory of mine. Stephanie, if you want to share one of yours, you're welcome to jump in here as well. I was about 8 years old, and my uncle was an incredible tinkerer, a sort of amateur engineer who was always building things. And he brought over to my house a go-kart that he had constructed himself and was going to allow me to play with it. And it was a completely unexpected thing. I had no experience with it, but I tore around the yard in this thing. It was really incredibly fun, until I realized that because my uncle was an amateur engineer and had built this thing himself, he hadn't bothered to put brakes on the go-kart. And being maybe surprised that there was no other pedal to push, I didn't realize I needed to switch it off. And so I decided that the best way to create brakes for my new go-kart was to simply drive it into the shed in our backyard, which was a subject of some laughter for a long time, but luckily no injuries to anyone other than maybe my pride. Stephanie, anything you would like to share?
Well, I actually have a number that have been typed into the question box.
Oh, great. Yeah, get a couple.
So slip and slide with my friend Robbie down the hill by his house. Family trip to Kashmir in 1974. That sounds awesome. Driving to Alaska with my dad when I was 10. A beautiful birthday memory with my late grandmother. Bicycling around the neighborhood. Sounds a little familiar. Learning how to ride a two-wheel bike for the first time. There's a lot of bicycle memories here. Okay, here's a strange one. Creating cars out of banana stems. So I'm going to kind of need to know more about that, either later in the session or afterwards. Riding horses on what is now I-95 in the Bronx. Another bicycle one, playing with my younger cousin and his tricycles. Let's see, the log cabin I built in the backyard using the logs from the palm tree. We got a whole bunch going on. But I think, you know, kind of gets to your point that these are the things that we remember, and those can be the most influential in, you know, helping persuade other people to agree with you.
Yeah, absolutely, Stephanie. Thanks everybody for sharing those. Those are terrific. I always enjoy this exercise with groups. One thing I would like for you to think about before we move on from your childhood memory is whatever it was that came to your mind, whether you put it in the chat box or whether you just thought about it sitting wherever you are. I want you to go back to that memory, and I want you to think about how you experienced the memory of your memory. Were you able to see the images move? That is, was the action like looking at a photograph, or was it more like watching a movie? Were you aware of the context, smells or sights, things that weren't directly connected to the narrative of what happened, learning to ride the bike, but maybe the parking lot that you were in or the grassy slope that you learned on or whatever it was? The reason I mention this is because what we have found is that very often people experience these memories in a very rich textural way when they think about them, and it's surprising the things that are not directly associated with the narrative that come to the mind. And most people experience these memories as movies in their mind. They're not so much still photographs as they are almost like watching a video of the memory transpire. And I raise this at the outset to make the point that Stephanie was lifting up there just a second ago, that memories are powerful things and stories are powerful things in terms of the way our brains are wired and how we experience the world and how we add meaning. And I think as we explore how we want to begin crafting messages that are powerful and persuasive to whatever our target audience is, it's important that we keep in mind sort of this role of story, and tapping into those kinds of deeply held memories and sensations can be incredibly powerful things. The quote that you have here is, I'll indulge a scientific audience in just a little bit of science, although I know I quickly get in over my head, not being a scientist myself. So I'll be careful and freely advertise that I'm cherry picking from some of the data here. But this is a quote from an important figure in medical history. You may be familiar with the story of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage worked on the railroads in New Hampshire in the 19th century. His job was to help pack dynamite, gunpowder, if you will, into into the granite rock so that it could be exploded in order to make way for the railroad. Unfortunately for Phineas, as he was packing gunpowder into rock one day, the metal rod that he used to pack in the gunpowder sparked against the granite and created an explosion that shot the metal rod through his head. He became quite a famous figure of sorts in that part of the 19th century because he survived. He survived this and lived quite a long time afterward, and was something of a marvel for people. However, he was a marvel in multiple ways, not only because he survived, but because he survived in a way that was very curious to his neighbors and to folks in the community, because on one hand, he was clearly able to process information in a rational way. He could do basic math. He was not unable to understand what was happening around him in the world. On the other hand, he had lost a whole range of sort of basic inhibitions and had very little ability to sort of control his emotions and the outward expression of his emotions. Later on, as modeling and brain science began to evolve, a lot more was learned about what was really happening in poor Phineas's brain. It turns out that only a certain segment of his brain had been essentially damaged and destroyed by the blast of the rod. And when they mapped that, they realized that what had happened with Phineas is that his emotional decision-making had been completely affected. The part of his brain that controlled that side of his emotional response and really the sort of emotionally led understanding of the world was the piece that had been damaged, which led to a whole series of insights and additional research that really began to pull apart the fact that when we make decisions, particularly when we make decisions that form our opinion of the world, that the pieces of our brain work together in an interesting way, so that it's never really a purely rational approach that allows us to make the decisions, that there's a whole layer of emotional decision making that's really important. Furthermore, as sort of research evolved on the role of the brain and how we make decisions, there were some other studies that sort of elevated this idea that very often narrative is preferable to analytical messaging alone. And let me emphasize that word alone. I'm really not suggesting that we toss analytics aside. They certainly work together. But some of these other things showed us the power of things like empathy and mirror empathy as something that humans do, so that we can actually project ourselves into stories, and that becomes a much easier path to changing the opinion that someone already has. There was an interesting study that was done that examined people who were presented with information that contradicted a strongly held view that they already had. So in this particular study, folks who had an opinion pro or con about capital punishment were brought in and then presented with information that contradicted what they believed about the role of capital punishment as a deterrent factor. And interestingly, what they found is that when people were confronted with information that clearly contradicted their existing beliefs, that it caused them to double down. It did not lead them to change their mind. In fact, it made them more resistant to changing their mind. When they went in and they mapped parts of the brain that were energized as part of experiencing, looking at information that contradicts what they already believe, they actually found that the same parts of the brain that are triggered in a pain response were being activated seeing this information. So I like to say to audiences that, it literally hurts to change your mind. And so we have to begin to think about if we're taking an audience that may be skeptical or outright hostile to the kinds of information that we're presenting, continuing to just push a very fact and analytically led approach is likely to trigger resistance. And that resistance isn't just stubbornness, it's actually embedded in how our brains are wired and how we experience information in the world. And for communicators, this is important. And you can see the link on the slide here to the Fast Company article, certainly not a science publication by any means, but I put it here because our friends in marketing and advertising have been very quick on understanding the implications of some of this and adapting their work in ways that try to take advantage of how people form their opinions and can be persuaded. And I think there's a lot for us to learn, even if we don't individually find advertising to be particularly persuasive. Certainly the role of story in other sorts of areas of life has grown. I was reading an article about the role of storytelling in corporate C-suites as a new approach to not just to management, but really to how they're engaging with customers in all sorts of ways, well beyond just traditional marketing. I want to shift a little now. I hope some of that laid the foundation for why I'm talking to you about story so specifically here. Now I want to shift a little bit to talk about, well, if story is key to helping us be more persuasive communicators, how do we actually go about creating stories? And what do they look like? Particularly, what do they look like? Yeah.
This is Stephanie. Can I interrupt for a moment? Because I've got some questions on what you were just covering that I want to make sure that we got to in the right place.
Go for it.
So one was, how do we position this statement, quote, facts don't influence, usually backfire, to the post-truth era?
Well, that is a very good question, and I just want to be clear that I'm not suggesting here that facts don't matter. I think they're critical, particularly when we think about, and we're going to, Stephanie, I think when you talk about the media a little bit later, that's a good example of what I'm about to say here. There are a lot of audiences for whom, if we don't have fact, we're not going to get very far in terms of influencing them or being persuasive to them. The point here is that for a lot of fields, and frankly, health and science really high on the list. I do a lot of work with engineers and architects have a similar sort of challenge because the field itself is fact-led, data-driven. I'm going to talk in just a second about some of the challenges I think science communicators have that are distinctive to that field. But because that's the instinct of what you want to lead with, there's a tendency to downplay or eliminate what may feel like anecdotal information. And in fact, in some cases, it is simply an anecdote. But if it's an illustrative anecdote, it pulls people in a different way. So by finding stories that allow the listener to see themselves as a character in what you're talking about, to activate their impulses toward empathy and their interest in following a narrative, it pulls them in a way that then allows you to bring forward the facts in a way that it has a very different impact than when it's fact-led. I think when we lead with fact, and I do mean that in the literal sense of starting with, leading by starting with that information, that either people find it to be difficult and abstract to understand, or they disagree. And because we live in a world where, to be honest with you, everybody has their fact sheet. Everybody has a fact sheet. So no matter what side of an issue you're on, you can rest assured that whatever interest group is on the other side, they're going to have a fact sheet with numbers and charts that tells a different story than what you're suggesting. Doesn't mean they're right. You want to be clear, like facts are facts. That I'm not sort of suggesting that everybody gets their own facts. But I will say that folks are very good at finding information that can be turned into facts that contradict you. And so you have to chart a path that gets us out of this he said, she said dynamic that often dominates a lot of coverage that you see in journalistic circles. And I hope some of the slides to come here will give you a window into how we leverage the facts and leverage the data in ways that are powerful by incorporating this idea of story and narrative. And Stephanie, you're welcome to jump in with your own observations.
That was just a question that I thought was a good one for where we were going in the presentation. So yeah, and there's other good questions, guys. I'm monitoring them. So
absolutely, we definitely want to save some time to get to them. On that point of sort of moving from the abstract to something that is easier for people to follow and understand, that's sort of what this slide is aiming to do. In terms of helping you think about, from all the information that you have at your disposal as a communicator, what are the pieces that you pull out to tell the story, right? How do we take those anecdotes that we might have, or the example that we have seen, and pull that into our messaging in a way that works and triggers those those things that make stories persuasive. Very often you will see those words sort of at the top of the arrow are where I think a lot of communicators start. That is, they start at a more abstract level, the sort of the collective as opposed to the individual. Where we want to go as storytellers, as communicators leveraging the power of narrative, is to really think about those very basic stories. If you have children or children in your family, think about those early stories that fill childhood. They're very specific. They have a context. Your story should have a context. It should have a setting that can be readily understood. Going back to your childhood memory, when you ground a story in an actual place, you trigger all sorts of things going on in the listener's mind, right? So instead of saying it's happening in a city or a community, when you talk about a specific place, it gives a different texture. Secondly, instead of talking about broad demographic groups, individualize it. Now, your point, your facts, your ultimate ask or your ultimate point of the communication can be about the collective, but demonstrate the collective by pulling out the individual. Give us a hero, sometimes give us a villain, but bring us into the life of an individual person. And in some cases, you may be able to, create an individual that's representative of a larger sample that you may be working with, but it's important to humanize it in some way, and then send them on that journey. Send them through the course of a series of challenges that forms the narrative of the story, right? What's the conflict that they're trying to overcome? What are the obstacles in their way? How are they being transformed by things that are happening around them? Often these are the problem issues that your solution ultimately is going to provide a resolution for. It needs to have some tone to it. It needs to have some feeling. So moving from just the thinking side of the brain to how we feel. Are we worried? Is there suspense? Are we angry? Are we sympathetic to the characters? These are all things that that story brings out in a very effective way. And then ultimately the goal of all of this is getting us to a point of persuasion, so that as we think about what was it that allowed that hero to overcome those obstacles, that gets us to a resolution. It's not always a happy ending. In some cases it may be a lesson and not a very happy ending at all, but it points us to a happier ending if we then accept some sort of larger truth. So as we think about, crafting a story, so you're sitting there with a body of research, you want to talk to the press about it, you want to talk to a partner organization about it, how do you begin to go in and actually figure out the words to say? Certainly, you know the point that you want to make. You have your research finding that you want to get across. Perhaps there's a public policy action that needs to be taken based on the findings that you have. But how are you going to craft a story that gets you to that influence? One of the things you need to do first is figure out your ending. Figure out the point of what it is that you're trying to say, and then figure out that ending of the story that you want to tell. When you start by knowing where you're going, you're in a much more effective place to pull together the things that you need to be effective. We're going to talk more in a few minutes about audience, but audience is really critical, and thinking hard about who they are, not just who you are. What matters to them? What drives them? What are the kinds of stories that might move them in a way that the overall topic might not? And I think this is really key for curating the stories that make their way into your overall messaging. Once you know your audience, then it becomes much easier to think about what are the points of common ground. This is particularly important, I think, when you're dealing with the public or when you're dealing with stakeholder groups, to think about where they're coming from, the things that they may already have as a goal or a value or their agenda. Then that allows you to begin to humanize your pitch, humanize yourself, break down some of the more abstract pieces of information that you have to share with that story. But within that scope, you certainly want to ensure that you have focus on getting toward that ending that you want to create. And very often that's going to involve some sort of ask. And by ask, what I mean here, it's sort of the point that you want to make. In a legislative context, which I know Stephanie's going to talk about more in a subsequent training, you may have a very specific policy position that you want to see changed. In other cases, it may be a little bit broader in terms of actions that individuals should take to be healthier citizens or whatever it is, but you sort of have a point, and your ask connects to your ending. The next point here on the slide is one that I think technical audiences struggle with mightily, and that is the use of jargon and figuring out how to find other ways, or even just being aware that jargon is jargon. It can feel so second nature to a communicator because they're so steeped in the field. But it can really be a barrier for your listener, particularly, reporters who may have a very thin knowledge of the field. You just want to try to avoid that and speak in as basic a way as you can so that it's well understood and communicated. So I've spent a lot of time already talking about story, but story actually fits into a framework of different kinds of communication. I'll give you an example here more specifically in just a second so you can see how this operates. But when we think about sort of the arc of communications with our audiences, typically there are kind of four pillars of what we're focused on. One is your message, one is a narrative, there's a story that reinforces the narrative, and then all of your information sort of operates within a broader framework of understanding about an issue. And let me just give you a quick example using some of the work that I've done in the climate science space. Now, this is purely an example. I am not suggesting this is the way we go about convincing people to take action on climate change. So I'm not handing this to you as a way to do it necessarily, only that I think it will help you understand sort of the differences between and among these various pillars of communication. So your message, if you're talking to an audience about climate change, could be that if we don't take action on climate and we don't make our communities more resilient, there's going to be an economic cost, right? So we've done research. We know what the costs of this inaction are. We understand that it costs more to replace infrastructure than it does to make it more resilient and so forth. So we have this as the message that we want to communicate. And we have probably started with the idea that there's something specifically we want the public or the policymaker or the reporter writing the story to come away with, some action that we want them to take. And this is the message to drive them there. Okay, so if that's our message, what's the narrative that we're going to wrap around that fairly abstract idea of climate resiliency and economic cost? Well, one narrative could be that as weather gets worse and we have these more extreme storms, that has the potential to really have huge impacts on real estate that's in those vulnerable places. Think about coastal property, or think about whole communities that are in places that may be vulnerable to sea level rise or storms. So this is our narrative, that the weather is changing, that conditions are changing that can be observed, and that's going to have this real potentially devastating impact on who owns the property in those places. A story could be, if that's our narrative, a story would be perhaps about a family who owns a home or business in one of those places, and they're confronting the loss of the major economic asset in their whole lives through the higher costs or the lower value or just greater risk, insurance issues, whatever it is. And you can imagine easily being able to find a very specific family, a very specific individual whose personal story fits that narrative, and the narrative fits inside that message that we're trying to create. Now, the last piece is one of the harder ones to understand, but it's the framework that we're trying to invoke through the preceding three elements. So the frame here is trying to get people to tackle climate change because of a lens placed on economic self-interest, right? On basic fairness. These people bought property, and it's only fair that we should do something to ensure that they're not completely stuck with the loss. There's a sort of core economic driver here to the message. That's the frame that we're trying to evoke. Notice here, this frame is completely different than trying to think about, I don't know, impacts on future generations, or environmental problems, or social equity concerns related to who bears the brunt of the impacts. Those are all legitimate ways to tackle climate, but by being very intentional about the frame that we're evoking, it really helps us understand the kinds of narratives and stories that will bring our message forward. So as you're thinking about your own efforts at communicating around the research that you're doing or the findings that you want to communicate, take the time at the outset to not only figure out who your audience is and what that happy ending is for your story, but then place those things in this context. What is the message that the research is telling you? And then what is the narrative and story that brings that message to life? And how are we going to frame this? And are we invoking the right frame? Because if you're trying to invoke an environmental frame and your story is economically driven, you're going to have dissonance that's going to undermine your ultimate effectiveness as a communicator. I mentioned before that I think scientists sometimes have a steeper hill to climb for a few reasons when it comes to certain kinds of ways of communicating. Partly it's because you have to keep in mind that you're not the audience. So the things that you might find persuasive, go back to that poll that we did at the very outset of the presentation and think about the fact that the majority of you all are persuaded by reports, facts, and figures, but the majority of the public is not always persuaded that way, or at least they're flooded with enough reports, facts, and figures that they are confused on the issue at best. It's easy to believe that we are the audience for our own message, and the things that we find personally and individually persuasive are the things that we should lead with. Sometimes that might be true, and there are certainly audiences where you would want to lead with that, but you need to, again, think about that audience. The second challenge that I think science sometimes faces in kind of public policy oriented communications is what we might think of as the Cassandra problem. Harkening back to kind of the messenger of future doom from Greek mythology. And I know Stephanie's a resident expert on Greek mythology, so she can fill in a lot more of the texture of that particular story. But the problem that you have here is that you're often talking about negative future outcomes and relying on the fact that people believe you as a messenger that you're accurately predicting this. Part of the challenge here is that in some instances, the action that you want people to take prevents the outcome that you are predicting. And when we look backwards, it causes skepticism because people say, oh, well, they told us this was going to happen, but it didn't happen. Of course, often the reason that it didn't happen or didn't happen in as severe a way as was predicted is because those mitigation steps were taken. But I think for those of you who may be talking about, you know, sort of very challenging potential future outcomes, we have to keep in mind, you know, what it means to be a messenger in that way, and how do we both raise the specter of that potential problem without sort of damaging our, you know, the sense of us as a credible messenger. Which kind of leads me to the last one, which is a bacon problem, and I mean Sir Francis, not the breakfast food problem here, and that's the scientific method itself is sometimes a bit of a challenge for us as communicators, because many folks who are steeped in scientific approach, scientific method, research, they always leave a little bit of room, right? Because the data can change and the situation could shift. We have to be open to understanding all of the potential hypotheses that are out there. They get tested and then we move forward. Science isn't absolute, it's incremental in many respects. As our understanding expands, there are always changes, right? I mean, if you take out the science book that I went to school with, you know, 20 years ago, there are pieces in there that are no longer accepted belief in the scientific community, and that's because the field is always changing and evolving based on, you know, understanding the world in new and better ways. As a communicator, though, and this has been really true in climate science and some other areas, there's a tendency to sort of hold open or expose people to the fact that, you know, there's a certain equivocation, I guess, is one way to think about it. And I'm not arguing that you should become absolutist, only that you need to understand your audience and understand how you are presenting that. So the kinds of things that you might choose to say to a colleague or to a peer-reviewed journal or a conference of other academicians, that needs to be quite different from the way that you might communicate to a more lay audience about an issue. So I think as we think about how we craft these messages and these narratives and these stories, we have to keep in mind some of the blind spots that many times we have when we're coming from a more technical space as a communicator. Let me pause here for a second because I do want to talk about some of the characters in our stories. I think, Stephanie, you've got another poll for us.
Yep, I do indeed. I am pulling it up right now. And let's see. Oh, sorry. I almost started with villains instead of heroes. All right. So here it is. Who is your favorite hero amongst these? And for those who heard Jason's commentary on my love of Greek mythology, know who mine is, but any of them are fun. And we've got about 45% of the vote in, so we'll wait for another couple minutes. Well, not a couple minutes. Maybe another 30 seconds.
There you go.
Well, everybody contemplates. And I have actually considered one of these as not necessarily the hero of the story, but I won't say who. All right, we've got about 70% in, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So there you have it. Hermione Granger is at about 24%. Jay Gatsby is at 4%. Yeah, I have to say that Gatsby was my one who I was sort of on the fence about. The Black Panther is at 44%, Indiana Jones is at 21%, and Odysseus is at a disappointing 7%.
Excellent, excellent. Want to shift over to the villains now?
Oh, yes, let me do the villains. Hold on a moment. Let's see. And here we go with your favorite villains. Yeah, we're getting the responses in. I feel like for this crowd, we should have had, you know, some facts and figures and statistics on how many people they've murdered or.
Right.
All right. We got 60% of the votes in. I'm going to let it go for another couple seconds, and we can figure out who we all hate. All right. I got about 70% of the votes in, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So this is much more evenly split. Many of us hate the Grinch more than anything, so that's 31%. So wins the plurality. And then we've got Catwoman at 18%, Darth Vader at 24%, Voldemort at 13%, and Dracula at 14%. So sort of much more even there than the heroes.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Of course, there are no right or wrong answers here. Just wanted to throw that out there to get your mind thinking a little bit about some fairly archetypal heroes and villains. You know, I made the point earlier about the importance of character in our stories, and to make them specific. And so obviously, you know, stories are filled with heroes and villains. One of the things that might have occurred to you, Stephanie actually, you know, made this point herself when she was talking about Gatsby, is that sometimes the line between a hero and a villain can be a fine one, and that we have damaged heroes, we have sympathetic villains sometimes. Very often in literature and in film theater, you will find that the most captivating of the characters can be the villain. I want you to think about these different kinds of characters, because when you think about many of them, you know, think about the Grinch, right? So the Grinch, most of you picked the Grinch, or a plurality of you picked the Grinch. You know, clearly a bad guy, right? Ruins Christmas, terrible. At the same time, the story there is about a story of transformation, right? Why he became a Grinch, how he transformed into something else by the end of the story. We see this very often, not just with heroes, but even with villains, where, you know, wants and desires lead toward a journey that creates some sort of transformation. I had an English professor once who made the comment that, you know, in his view, there were really only two stories that had ever been written. One was A Man Takes a Journey, and the other is A Stranger Comes to Town. And the point that he was making is that both of those stories sort of can be written in a whole bunch of different ways, but are really about encounter and transformation. And when we're thinking about communicating, often in a context where there's a public policy issue or a public behavior that is at the core of what we're communicating about, there's often a transformation that has to go on in terms of our understanding. And so that may help you think about how you layer in story. You, of course, become the narrator in this environment, generally speaking, as the storyteller, as the communicator. And we know from literature there are all sorts of different kinds of narrators. Some are not very trustworthy. In this instance, projecting as authentic and even to some degree vulnerable is a very powerful position for the narrator to be in. And of course, you know, going back to the kind of key role of the audience, because we want to understand them well enough that we're telling stories that build that empathy and that generate a real desire to want to see what happens to those characters that you have created. So with that in mind, I want to share an example from a campaign that I was part of a long time ago for a ballot initiative in St. Louis. So this is an example. Nurse Nancy isn't real. I'll say that from the outset. This is a political ad, so that's a a little bit different form of communication. But when we think about humanizing abstract issues, there's something I think useful in this little example. So just to set the context for you here, this was a sales tax increase campaign. It had failed with the voters about a year before they reran the campaign. And when they reran the campaign, the folks who were handling communications on this took a very different approach, where instead of focusing on the transit itself, on the train that they were going to build with the sales tax, they thought a lot about the individuals involved. So I hope this works. Stephanie, you'll have to let me know if the sound isn't coming through properly for the audience here. I'm gonna go ahead and play.
I'm here on the 57 bus to St. Louis talking to passengers about transit. Hi there, what's your name?
Nancy.
And you ride a transit?
I do every day.
A lot of people do. In St. Louis, transit gives over 100,000 rides a day.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do?
I'm a nurse.
Oh, if there wasn't any transit, you couldn't get to work.
Not where I live now. I'd have to move or find another job.
And if you couldn't get to work and I happened to go to the hospital,
you die.
So it's a matter of life and death.
Absolutely.
Makes you think of all the people we rely on who rely on transit.
It sure does.
Healthcare workers, office workers, store clerks, teachers, servers.
Nurses.
Nurses, sure.
Radio announcers.
Right. Transit. Some of us ride it, all of us need it.
Yeah, you wouldn't really die. I was just joking, you know.
Oh, I'm glad.
You might have to wait for a bedpan, though.
Paid for by Citizens for Modern Transit.
So that spot was part of a larger campaign, and really the whole theme, you heard it referenced there, was, you know, some of us ride it, all of us need it, transit. This campaign completely turned around their loss from a year prior to an almost 2/3 victory subsequently. I won't put all of it down to the communications, but I will say that Nurse Nancy spot and a series of similar spots that really focused on humanizing the value of transit and using humor and using some sort of unexpected twists in the storyline were a big part of it. And in fact, when you looked at the social media that was happening around the campaign, people completely outside the campaign sort of latched on to some of these characters like Nurse Nancy and made their own, you know, took it in their own direction. What's important here, I think, and one of the reasons why I wanted to share it, is that, you know, there's a value here in finding those unexpected heroes, in dramatizing the conflict in a particular way, and in really flipping the script so that as the listener of this spot encounters this, they may have a lot of preset ideas about transit. They may plan never to use transit. They don't like the train or the bus. They like driving, whatever. But this sort of reframed it for them in the context of, what about an elderly parent who may be in a care home? What about, you know, other people in their family or friends of theirs who need care that's being provided by people who are transit dependent? I think, you know, particularly in the world we live in now, all of our awareness has been raised about people who are in essential positions, who don't have the luxury of working from home, and we see them all the time and we realize how critical they are. It's a very different way of framing a conversation about, you know, whether we should raise the sales tax to build light rail in St. Louis. And I think there's some lessons that we can take from that. And really, you know, what we want to do here is help people envision a future that may be difficult for them to see and understand through the stories that we're offering. And if you remember back just to that spot that I just shared, there was a key fact that was embedded in there, that transit in St. Louis provides over 100,000 rides a day. So it's not as if it exists in a sort of fact-free universe, but we're using those facts in conjunction with a narrative that helps people see a different future. And that's important when we're thinking about persuasive communications. There's a book that came out from a Nobel Prize winning economist last year, actually interestingly came out right before coronavirus took over the world, that actually applied epidemiological models to economics. So Robert Shiller is famous in the behavioral economic space, and he wrote this book where he basically analyzed different kind of key economic moments in recent history to demonstrate that the stories and the narratives that get told around economics actually have an effect on the economics themselves. And he gave, some compelling examples, around various asset bubbles that have been created, right? So people begin to hear stories about housing values, for instance, about a decade or so ago, and that began to shape their actual behavior. So they hear the stories of their neighbors making a lot of money or whatever it is, and it begins to shape their purchasing behavior. And then that collective narrative, as people talk about this more broadly, as the media picks it up, it actually begins to shape events. And so I think there's a lesson to be extracted here about the power of the stories that people begin to share and that we hold collectively have tremendous power, have power, political power, they have social power, they have the power to move not only kind of key decision makers, but also affect things like the economy in broad ways. Now, clearly, it's difficult to figure out how does one create a quote contagious story, or how do we take a story and turn it into a collective narrative. But these things do have power, and in a way, they have power far beyond. I mean, one of the points that Schiller makes is that you can parse out from an economics perspective a very different approach to a behavioral outcome, but it's the story that drives what people are choosing to do, and that it's not a purely academic exercise in how people are making their overall decisions. We're seeing local governments get in on this act too. There are at least 3 major cities around the country that have created a new position of chief community storyteller, and they're doing this not simply in the way that they try to sell their city to tourists or conventioneers. They're doing it actually to help people who are living in that community understand the place better. And what they have found is that when they want to engage people about what the future of that community should be, that it's really very valuable to have understood the stories that already exist in communities and neighborhoods, how people understand the place themselves, and reflect that back to them in how a project is proposed or how it's presented. I think what the lesson there is they're clearly understanding that story is essential to a sense of place. We understand place through story, and that if we want to engage people either to protect an asset or protect a sense of community, or we want to talk about how community is changing, figuring out what those stories are, tapping them, using them, engaging people around them can be enormously powerful. And again, just gives us another window into how we shape opinions, how we can drive persuasion through understanding the stories that underlie places. So I'm going to pause there with my part of the presentation. I think Stephanie's going to take us, start taking us home by digging a little bit deeper into how we might apply some of these lessons in terms of very specific audiences. So Stephanie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Jason. And before I get to that, I'm going to read you some of the questions that we've got so that you can think about them while I'm saying brilliant things. Okay, so let's see. So here was one. So the frame may vary depending on the audience or stakeholder, ? So that's one of them. Let's see. Someone would like to hear some examples of using humor to communicate science, which I think the Nurse Nancy thing did a little bit, but there might be others that you can think of. And so I believe that I already raised this one. How do you humanize the data when there's so much misinformation? And let me see, we've got other questions coming in. So I will go ahead and leave those with you for now, and then we can address more at the end. I've got just a few things to say before we wrap it up, but we'll have plenty of time for questions. So first of all, as Jason mentioned, we've talked a lot about stories and how to develop them and what the pieces of them are. So my goal here is to just give some thoughts on how you might deliver them for specific kinds of audiences. And to me, there's a few different styles. One-on-one audiences, there will be stakeholder audiences, there will be obviously communicating with the media. So for one-on-one audiences, to me, these are when you are sitting down with, it might be someone in your university, it might be someone in the community who you want to, it might be your patient. We had someone ask a question about that, who you want to relay both facts and story to. And where you start with that is to make sure that you understand that audience, and to the point that you can actually, if you know something personal about that person, not that, you want to get too personally involved with them, but for example, if you're a doctor and you have a patient, knowing something about them, do they have kids? Are those kids in soccer? Are they married? Do they know anything about their spouse? Did you go to the same university? Even those small little things can help you start framing your story in a way that makes perfect sense to them. When you start talking about facts and figures, that sounds like something that, anyone, that you would be relaying to anyone. And what you're trying to do is tell them, these are facts and figures that relate very specifically to you. Because as Jason says, that's what does trigger some of that, interest in the facts and figures, or in understanding more about the issue. An example I usually give is when you go to Starbucks and you're going to order some cake donut or something that's a ridiculous amount of calories. And now Starbucks and other places have started putting the calorie counts on every piece of food that is in the store. That has actually, they've found, reduced people's willingness to purchase the items, because they look at that and they say, oh, that's 400 calories. They're not thinking to themselves, that number, that's 400 calories. What they're thinking to themselves is, if I eat that, I will gain weight, or if I eat that, that will cut into my calorie counts for the day, for those people who are concerned about those things. So what's interesting to me is that when Starbucks led with those facts and figures, it actually did reduce some of their sales. Now, of course, they have to do that in certain jurisdictions where that's required. But it does tell me that, facts and figures don't always help when you're trying to argue something, and particularly with one-on-one kinds of audiences. And so with those kinds of audiences, again, I suggest that you really basically just figure out very specifically what that person is most interested in, wrap a story around what you want to try and tell them, and then, make sure that they've got that information that you want to relay in terms of the facts and figures. So the next slide. And so the next one, the next audience is stakeholders. And these tend to be people in the community, or people at the university, or, people at the state level who you are trying to influence on something that you're working on. And of course, they might be legislators, they might be, groups, they might be interest groups, they might be people within a community. And what they want to know is, how does this thing that you're talking about impact me? They don't necessarily want to know, sort of the broader issue of the facts and figures. They want to know, hey, I'm a person living my life every day, or a stakeholder group wants to know, hey, we're stakeholders who are influencing this decision. How does this impact us? And instead of starting with, here are the scientific facts, you start with, here's how it impacts us. Here's what I'm talking about, or will give you details on, will impact you and your life on a day-to-day basis. And so stakeholders, you really need to understand sort of about them a lot more comprehensively. So if you're talking to an environmental group, I'm not saying that you go in and you just talk about environmental facts and figures if that's not what you want to talk about. But when you're talking to that kind of group, it's always good to understand, hey, they are a pro-climate change, policy group, or solving climate change policy group. And so here are the things, and they're interested in saving the polar bears. And so I need to really focus in on that issue and what findings I have around that specific issue. And then I can tell them the larger story about, how we can help them with addressing climate change. And then next slide. And then, of course, there's the media. And the media really, really, really wants sound bites. They want that little quick, nifty thing that you say that's a sentence. that relays a broader principle that you're trying to get across to them. And one way I tend to talk to people about this is when you read a story or you hear something on the news or you listen to something on the radio, you'll find that they usually start with some sort of story about how the thing that they're talking about impacts a specific person. And I guarantee you, if you go and read the newspapers, you'll see that there's a local, either a local story or a national story or something that starts it off before they say things like 4 out of 5 Americans believe X, or 30% of carbon dioxide causes this, or the COVID pandemic is being caused by this. Before they start putting those facts and figures in, they usually have a story about it. So for the media, the television likes visual, something visual, like a picture or something along those lines, obviously. Radio likes the audio sound bites. The internet, the newspapers like stories, or the newspapers to the extent that they still exist. And the internet tends to like all of those depending on what medium you're using. So, understanding what kinds of things the media is looking for is very important. Next slide. And so my formula, which you do require an acronym every day in Washington, D.C., is to stay on topic and remember to SPIT. And SPIT stands for specific, personal, informative, and timely. So Jason gave you a framework for how you develop a story, and this is a way to sort of deliver it. So you want to be specific about how that story, or how the information you're relaying impacts that person. You want to make a personal connection. So how does, how very specifically you, human being, or you, stakeholder group, or you, media, who I'm using to try and get to a broader audience, how very specifically is what I'm talking about impact you? That's then when the informative comes in, because I think Jason and I aren't saying like skip all the facts and figures. We're saying kind of approach it from the opposite side as you might normally do. And so informative, you do want to have some facts and figures, but it's important that those facts and figures relate to the interests of the entity that you're talking about. So again, we'll talk about this in a congressional communications workshop a little later, but if you're talking to a legislator, for example, they would want to know how things impact their specific constituents. They're not going to want to know what 4 out of 5 Americans think. So if you're talking to a stakeholder group that's, involved in environmental issues, they don't want to know what 4 out of 5 Americans generally think. They want to know what 4 out of 5 people who are concerned about the environment think. And then timely, obviously these messages need to come at a certain time that make them relevant, that makes it possible for you to, impact a decision that's going to be made right away. And for right now, obviously, we've been sort of thrust into a situation in which we need to be delivering messages in a timely fashion. But we can also sometimes plan those predictable windows. So, for example, if you know that a state legislature is thinking of doing something, you would want to keep track of when they need the information to make decisions, and then start delivering your message then. And then one last acronym that I want to throw out there is what I call WOW, which is woo them, wow them, win them. And that doesn't spell wow, but that's kind of the way I think it. Woo them, wow them, win them. And so woo means, when you're starting to tell them a story or starting to give them a message, wooing them is, how does this relate to you? That's the piece that I'm talking about, like understanding how something relates to them. Wow is something really intriguing or interesting that they didn't know about what you're talking about. So, for example, again, I'll give the environmental group with the polar bears issue, because that seems, something that's pretty basic. So you go in and you say, hey, we understand that you're interested in polar bears and what's happening, to them as a species given climate change. And then you'd say, wow, the wow, I don't know an exact statistic, but did you know that 75% of polar bears have lost their homes due to climate change, or lost their habitats due to climate change? And then win is when you say, this is why our research connects to saving something that you care about. So woo them, wow them, win them, a pretty cool way to think about how you're going to approach different audiences, such as one-on-one audiences, stakeholders, and the media. And so with that, I think, Jason, if you can go to the next slide, I can pull up some of our questions and we can see where we are.
Yeah, Stephanie, I'll just kind of wrap up the presentation component. You know, you can see some of the points here. Just to leave you with, data alone it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. Stories are critical for motivating and changing behavior. You know, it really is important to not confuse the sharing of information with the crafting of a narrative, and that the sharing of the information should serve your narrative, which should drive your larger point. The last point here that I want to make is one that I think is still a space that's really evolving, and that is the virtual world that we're living in as communicators right now. I think much of which will outlast the pandemic in terms of how we engage with one another, offers some new opportunities for storytelling and delivery of narrative. And so as you think about communication, do think about both the challenges but also the opportunities that are presented by mediums like this one or Zoom or any of the other platforms that are out there, in terms of using different sorts of media to reinforce your overall message and your overall story. And I think we'll stop there, Stephanie. We'll take the last while in questions, and maybe I'll jump back in with a couple of the questions that you tossed out earlier. There was a question about whether the message frame varies depending on audience, and my answer to that is absolutely. You know, you certainly want to choose your frame based on what you know and understand about your audience. You know, just in very simplistic terms, going back to the climate example that I used earlier, that might be a framework that's a lot better if I'm communicating with a room full of CEOs or the local chamber of commerce. Then I might choose a different frame, for instance, if I was communicating with a group focused on environmental justice issues. And some of that's really obvious. I guess the thing that I would encourage you to take away from that conversation about frames is that in many cases, they're invisible to us, right? We don't spend a lot of time intentionally thinking about the frame that we're invoking. We might spend a lot of time thinking about our message and our data, even our stories, but we don't think about the framework that it lives in, and that's really important. And I would just encourage you to give that some thought, and be as intentional as you can be about, you know, what's the natural frame for the message that I have and what's going to resonate with a particular target audience.
And hey, Jason, can I jump in there in one quick moment? So to sort of narrow that down, basically look at things from the opposite that you may as someone from the academic community or a scientist from the scientific community. Instead of starting with the things that you usually start with, facts and figures, look at it from the perspective of the audience. So just switch it around the other way. I know that this audience is interested in this, so I'm going to pick this information about what I do and relate that specifically to them, at least for the beginning.
Yep.
That's all.
Great point. Great point. There was a question too, I'll kind of lump them together a little bit, about humanizing data and humor in science communications. I don't know that I have a great example, Stephanie, you might, about humor, but I do have some thoughts about how you might approach either humor or the humanizing of data in ways that are a little bit unexpected. You know, questions can be very powerful as attention grabbers. So sometimes you may want to pose a question to your audience, a question that you are going to answer for them, but it gets them thinking in a very different frame of mind, and it gets them to approach the information that you're presenting differently. In many instances, the audience presumes themselves to be a passive receiver of information by forcing a question on them, you change their posture, so to speak, and can make them more active. And also unusual questions can open up thinking and open up openness to hearing what you have to say in interesting ways. I was reading an interview, just a quick example here, that's from the world of music, and the introductory question, in fact, the way the whole thing was framed was, can you break a finger conducting Mahler? And I just thought, you know, I might not have read this piece, but it was such an arresting way of presenting it, that the power of that question sort of, you know, pulled me in a different way. Another vector that you might want to explore in terms of humanizing is history, and going back and using characters or events from the past in ways that, you know, allow you to tell a story that can be about something sort of tragic, even in a way that doesn't feel quite as difficult as telling it about it in a current context. So those may be some ways to think about adding a little humanity to you know, what can be otherwise a little cold sometimes.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, I don't have any humorous anecdotes right at the top of my head, but I'm going to think about that, and hopefully you can follow up with some ideas for you all afterwards. So I had another couple questions that came in. Doing research and find this is a very something I'm sure we all struggle with. Doing research and finding facts about stakeholders and their mission and values is all great, but what if they're still unwilling after presenting our concern with storytelling, narratives, and facts? So basically, what happens if they don't believe what we just said?
Well, that's a position.
Or they don't agree with us.
Yeah, that's a position that you're probably going to find yourself in more often than you'd like, particularly in a pretty polarized messaging environment these days. I think there are a few things you can do. One approach is to think about who does influence that audience, right? So, you know, Stephanie and I talk about this a lot in the context of elected officials, but I think it works in other kind of stakeholder group contexts as well. You know, everybody's influenced by something. And if you are not in a position to directly influence that audience, maybe you think about other groups that can be leveraged. If you can convince them, then they might be in a better position to be the messenger for you. Like, sometimes you might not be the most effective messenger. There might be built-in resistance. I'll tell you just you know, I won't tell you the full story when I have time, but I will say that having worked in the built environment space with planners and architects for a long time, one of the most effective ways that they have been able to pursue changing public opinion about things are to find groups like AARP, right, to be the kind of core messenger, because some of the design changes that they're interested in having adopted, say, as a part of a building code, they're really knowledgeable about those things, but they're not the best messenger, even when they tell a good story. But by finding people who can validate that story that they're telling, and be the face and voice for it, that can be an effective tool. Persistence also is just part of this game, right? So telling stories over and over, finding, you know, new avenues to tell that story, thinking about how to use other tools, right? So it might not be an op-ed as much as it is a social media campaign. I mean, there are all sorts of different upsides and downsides to individual tactics, but that's part of your approach as well. Stephanie, you may have some thoughts that you want to add on that question too.
Nope, you pretty much said. I mean, also sometimes it's not going to work. I mean, you will try all these strategies, and I can guarantee you that it will. Much of what you're doing will work better, but sometimes you're just not going to be able to convince people, especially, you know, folks who are pretty entrenched in their beliefs, and which we're seeing a lot of in this current political environment. So once you've created a great story, they still aren't willing to believe you, then you try and get other people to influence them. They're not willing to believe you. I mean, at some point, you just have to recognize that they're just they're just entrenched against you.
Well,
but as Jason points out too, go ahead, Jason.
Well, I was just going to say, sort of going back to that Robert Schiller idea, sometimes the way to convince the majority of people is to begin convincing a smaller group of people who begin to be messengers in an almost unconscious way for what you're talking about, right? So, people who worked on, the childhood vaccine issue, there's a core of people who are probably never going to be convinced no matter what happens, but there's been a lot of effective work done to shift the social narrative around that in ways that maybe, and you guys are closer to this issue than I am, maybe it hasn't been, 100% successful, but certainly has changed the dynamic when people are encountering that particular issue. So, I think there are ways to begin planting those messages and stories in ways that the cumulative social impact is sufficient to change overall opinion, or certainly change the minds of individual decision makers.
Right. Yeah, and I think I didn't mean to be too negative before. I just want to make sure, that people understand and that what Jason is talking about, that you may be able to sort of get smaller parts of the group to agree with you, and then hopefully over time you'll be able to change that narrative. Another thought, and I know we need to wrap up, but another thought is to try and get those groups to little tiny agreements. So maybe you're not going to be able to get them to agree on some larger issue, but you may be able to get them to agree on something smaller. They're willing to work with you. Sure, you're going to have to agree to disagree on a bigger issue, but they're willing to work with you on some narrow aspect of it or on something completely different. And once you do that, you start getting to know those people, and then you can start sharing, more personal stories, or more making it a more narrative situation, and then they may be more likely to agree with you. I think with that, we are at our 2:30 at our hour and a half point. We do have additional questions, but what I'll do is make sure that, we can do one of two things. We can just stay on the line and answer those specific questions, or we can answer them afterwards. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Martin, who will tell us which one of those he thinks we should do. So, Dr. Martin, you're up.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you, Jason, to answer the question. I think you've been kind enough to provide your emails on the bottom. So for those of you who are online, please email Stephanie and Jason with any questions you have, and they'll be able to answer those for you. I would really like to thank you very much, Jason, for your fabulous presentation. You have taught us the power of empathetic communication and how to use stories to really translate data into action and motivate people to support the actions we need to address the challenges we have. And Stephanie, thank you very much for teaching us how to deliver a message. I didn't know how to spit before, but being specific, personal, informative, timely, now I know. And thank you for merging that with your wow factor for being able to use the power of wooing, wowing, and winning people over. So thank you very much, Stephanie and Jason. We encourage all of you online to join us, and you can register now for the September 22nd session that Stephanie is going to do on how to engage your congressperson. And whether you are here in the US or around the world, Stephanie is going to show you some of the ways in which you can engage congresspersons regardless of where you live. So thank you very much for attending the session today. I'm Keith Martin, Executive Director of CUGH, and we look forward to seeing you next time on our webinar series. Bye for now.